From Creasy's Decisive Battles of the World, today we're going to read about the Battle of Tours. The Battle of Tours, AD 732. The events that rescued our ancestors of Britain and our neighbors of Gaul from the civil and religious yoke of the Koran. Gibbon. The broad tract of Champagne country which intervenes between the cities of Poitiers and Tours is principally composed of a succession of rich pasture lands, which are traversed and fertilized by the Cher, the Creuse, the Vienne, the Claine, the Indre, and other tributaries of the river Loire. Here and there the ground swells into picturesque eminences, and occasionally a belt of forest land, a brown heath, or a clustering series of vineyards breaks the monotony of the wind-spread meadows. But the general character of the land is that of a grassy plain, and it seems naturally adapted for the evolutions of numerous armies, especially of those vast bodies of cavalry which principally decided the fate of nations during the centuries that followed the downfall of Rome and preceded the consolidation of the modern European powers. This region has been signalized by more than one memorable conflict, but it is principally interesting to the historian by having been the scene of the great victory won by Charles Martel over the Saracens, AD 732, which gave a decisive check to the career of the Arab conquest in Western Europe, rescued Christendom from Islam, preserved the relics of ancient and the germs of modern civilization, and reestablished the old superiority of the Indo-European over the Semitic family of mankind. Sismondi and Michelet have underrated the enduring interest of this great appeal of battle between the champions of the crescent and the cross. But if French writers have slighted the exploits of their national hero, the Saracenic trophies of Charles Martel have had full justice done to them by English and German historians. Gibbon devotes several pages of his great work to the narrative of the Battle of Tours and to the consideration of the consequences which probably would have resulted if Abderraham's enterprise had not been crushed by the Frankish chief. Schlegel speaks of this mighty victory in terms of fervent gratitude, and tells how the arms of Charles Martel saved and delivered the Christian nations of the West from the deadly grasp of all-destroying Islam. And Rank points out, as one of the most important epochs in the history of the world, the commencement of the 8th century, when, on the one side, Mohammedanism threatened to overspread Italy and Gaul, and on the other, the ancient idolatry of Saxony and Friesland once more forced its way across the Rhine. In this peril of Christian institutions, a youthful prince of Germanic race, Karl Martel, arose as their champion, maintained them with all the energy which the necessity for self-defense calls forth, and finally extended them into new regions. Arnold ranks the victory of Charles Martel even higher than the victory of Arminius among those signal deliverances which have affected for centuries the happiness of mankind. In fact, the more we test its importance, the higher we shall be led to estimate it. And though the authentic details which we possess of its circumstances and its heroes are but meager, we can trace enough of its general character to make us watch with deep interest this encounter between the rival conquerors of the decaying Roman Empire. That old classic world, the history of which occupies so large a portion of our early studies, lay in the 8th century of our era, utterly exsanimate and overthrown. On the north, the German; on the south, the Arab was rending away its provinces. At last the spoilers encountered one another, each striving for the full mastery of the prey. Their conflict brought back upon the memory of Gibbon the old Homeric simile, where the strife of Hector and Patroclus over the dead body of ceremonies, is compared to the combat of two lions that, in their hate and hunger, fight together on the mountain tops over the carcass of a slaughtered stag. And the reluctant yielding of the Saracen power to the superior might of the northern warriors might not aptly recall those other lines of the same book of the Iliad, where the downfall of Patroclus beneath Hector is likened to the forced yielding of the panting and exhausted wild boar that had long and furiously fought with the superior beast of prey for the possession of the fountain among the rocks, at which each burned to drink. I want to note here that Gibbon's remarks, you see at the top of the page, that if the Saracen conquest had not then been checked, perhaps the interpretation of the Koran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford, and her pupils might demonstrate to a circumcised people the sanctity and truth of the revelations of Mohammed, has almost an air of regret. Although 3 centuries had passed away since the Germanic conquerors of Rome had crossed the Rhine, never to repass that frontier stream, no settled system of institutions or government, no amalgamation of the various races into one people, no uniformity of language or habits had been established in the country at the time when Charles Martel was called on to repel the menacing tide of Saracenic invasion from the south. Gaul was not yet France. In that, as in other provinces of the Roman Empire of the West, the dominion of the Caesars had been shattered as early as the 5th century, and barbaric kingdoms and principalities had promptly arisen on the ruins of the Roman power. But few of these had any permanency, and none of them consolidated the rest, or any considerable number of the rest, into one coherent and organized civil and political society. The great bulk of the population still consisted of the conquered provincials, that is to say, of Romanized Celts, of a Gallic race which had long been under the dominion of the Caesars, and had acquired, together with no slight infusion of Roman blood, the language, the literature, the laws, and the civilization of Latium. Among these, and dominant over them, roved or dwelt the Germanic victors, some retaining nearly all the rude independence of their primitive national character, others softened and disciplined by the aspect and contact of the manners and institutions of civilized life. For it is to be borne in mind that the Roman Empire in the West was not crushed by any sudden avalanche of barbaric invasion. The Germanic conquerors came across the Rhine not in enormous hosts, but in bands of a few thousand warriors at a time. The conquest of a province was the result of an infinite series of partial local invasions, carried on by little armies of this description. The victorious warriors either retired with their booty or fixed themselves in the invaded district, taking care to keep sufficiently concentrated for military purposes and ever ready for some fresh foray, either against a rival Teutonic band or some hitherto unassailed city of the provincials. Gradually, however, the conquerors acquired a desire for permanent landed possessions. They lost somewhat of the restless thirst for novelty and adventure which had first made them throng beneath the banners of the boldest captains of their tribe, and leave their native forests for a roving military life on the left bank of the Rhine. They were converted to the Christian faith, and gave up with their old creed much of the coarse ferocity which must have been fostered in the spirits of the ancient warriors of the North by a mythology which promised, as the reward of the brave on earth, an eternal cycle of fighting and drunkenness in heaven. But although their conversion and other civilizing influences operated powerfully upon the Germans in Gaul, and although the Franks, who were originally a confederation of the Teutonic tribes that dwelt between the Rhine, the Main, and the Weser, established a decided superiority over the other conquerors of the province, as well as over the conquered provincials, the country long remained a chaos of uncombined and shifting elements. The early princes of the Merovingian dynasty were generally occupied in wars against other princes of their house, occasioned by the frequent subdivisions of the Frank monarchy, and the ablest and best of them had found all their energies tasked to the utmost to defend the barrier of the Rhine against the pagan Germans, who strove to pass that river and gather their share of the spoils of the empire. The conquests which the Saracens effected over the southern and eastern provinces of Rome were far more rapid than those achieved by the Germans in the north, and the new organizations of society which the Moslems introduced were summarily and uniformly enforced. Exactly a century passed between the death of Mohammed and the date of the Battle of Tours. During that century, the followers of the Prophet had torn away half the Roman Empire, and besides their conquests over Persia, the Saracens had overrun Syria, Egypt, Africa, and Spain in an uncheckered and apparently irresistible career of victory. Nor at the commencement of the 8th century of our era was the Mohammedan world divided against itself as it subsequently became. All these vast regions obeyed the Caliph. Throughout them all, from the Pyrenees to the Oxus, the name of Mohammed was invoked in prayer, and the Koran revered as the book of the law. It was under one of their ablest and most renowned commanders, with a veteran army, and with every apparent advantage of time, place, and circumstance, that the Arabs made their great effort at the conquest of Europe north of the Pyrenees. The victorious Muslim soldiery in Spain. A countless multitude, Syrian, Moor, Saracen, Greek renegade, Persian and Copt, and Tartar in one bound, of erring faith conjoined, strong in the youth and heat of zeal, a dreadful brotherhood, were eager for the plunder of more Christian cities and shrines, and full of fanatic confidence in the invincibility of their arms. Nor were their chiefs of victory less assured by long success, elate and proud of that overwhelming strength, which surely they believed, as it had rolled, thus far unchecked, would roll victorious on, till, like the Orient, the subjected West should bow in reverence at Mahomet's name, and pilgrims from the remotest Arctic shores tread with religious feet the burning sands of Araby and Mecca's stony soil. Southey's Roderick. It is not only by the modern Christian poet, but by the old Arabian chronicler also, that these feelings of ambition and arrogance are attributed to the Muslims who had overthrown the Visigoth power in Spain. And their eager expectations of new wars were excited to the utmost on the reappointment by the Caliph of Abdurrahman ibn Abdullah al-Ghafiqi to the government of that country, A.D. 729, which restored them a general who had signalized his skill and prowess during the conquests of Africa and Spain, whose ready valor and generosity had made him the idol of the troops, who had already been engaged in several expeditions into Gaul, so as to be well acquainted with the national character and tactics of the Franks, and who was known to thirst, like a good Moslem, for revenge for the slaughter of some detachments of the true believers which had been cut off on the north of the Pyrenees. And we'll pause here, and we'll finish this in the second part. Thanks for watching. Love you guys. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.